From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Fiction Pavilion. I suspect a welcome is redundant because I suspect many of you have been glued to your seats all day. My name is Jonathan Yardley. I'm the book critic of the Washington Post, which is Thank you very much. The Post has been, since its inception in 2001, the Post has been an avid and very influential supporter of the National Book Festival and will continue to be as long as the book festival exists, which I suspect will be a very long time. 4 years ago, in the course of my reviewing duties, I stumbled across the bound galley proofs of a book called The Dream Life of Sukhanov. I had never heard of its author, Olga Grushin, and I'm not particularly well versed in contemporary fiction coming out of what was until recently the Soviet Union. But this looked like a particularly interesting and provocative book, and it turned out to be really one of the best works of fiction that I had read in a very long time. I ended up choosing it as one of my best books of the year, and I can assure you that come December of this year, I will be choosing Olga Grushin's second novel, The Line, as one of my best books of the year. It seems to, she makes me think of Joseph Conrad. She writes beautiful English in what was not her native language. She was born in Moscow, and she, rather than I, is going to tell you a bit about her absolutely fascinating life. Olga?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I feel that anything that will follow from me will probably diminish my image as a writer in everyone's eyes. So the best thing to do probably is to just get up and proceed to the signing. But I'll try. I was born in Russia and in a family of writers. So I always knew that I wanted to write. I come from 3 generations of nonfiction writers, journalists, scholars. My first auditory memory really was my father banging on his manual typewriter and my mother closing the door to his study saying, father is working, and I knew from the time when I was a baby that working meant writing. So for me, this was really part of my genetic makeup. I learned to read and write when I was very young, 4 or 5, mainly by pestering my much older brother than in high school as he was trying to do his homework. And then I proceeded to write my first short stories and fairy tales and poems. Now there is a well-acknowledged tendency of first-time novelists to turn to autobiographical material for their first novel. My first novel, The Dream Life of Sukhanov, which came out 4 years ago, used Moscow of the 80s, which is where I grew up, as a background, but really didn't have any other autobiographical similarities with my life. The protagonist is a 56-year-old artist, a man who gives up his art to become an art critic, kind of a bureaucrat from the arts under pressure. And people sometimes ask me, how did you manage to avoid the whole autobiographical impulse with your first book? Well, the truth is I didn't. The really first book that I wrote was published when I was 7. We had a family tradition. Every year, starting when I was 7, I would write a book-length work of fiction, and my father would type it up and bind it. I would illustrate it, and we would give it to my mother on her birthday. And that first story was called The Tale of a Lazy Princess. And in the story, there was a princess who really didn't want to learn how to make her bed and how to cook her family breakfast until her father, who was a very stern king, makes her do it. And then later on, she gets kidnapped by a dragon who threatens to eat her unless she cooks his breakfast, and if she burns his omelet, she'll be in trouble. So that stands her in good stead. And so this was very autobiographical, except for the dragon part. But everything else was quite true. So I always knew that I wanted to write. What I did not know was that I would write in English, and that came about quite unexpectedly. After I graduated from high school, I enrolled at Moscow State University, of course, at journalism department, which is what everyone in my family, literally everyone, father, mother, brother, had done. But then this was the height of perestroika, and it just so happened that I was given a scholarship, or I was offered a scholarship at Emory University, And this was in '89, and I would be the first Soviet citizen to come and get a 4-year American degree. And of course, it was an opportunity that I couldn't refuse. So I came to America, and then one thing led to another. I got a job, I got married, I had children. And throughout all this time, I continued to write. Of course, it was a passion of mine. But I wrote in Russian, and I wrote as the Russian expression goes into the drawer, which basically means for your own eyes only. And at some point, a couple of years after graduation, it suddenly occurred to me that if I really wanted to pursue my dream, and if I really wanted to see myself published, I would have to switch languages. And this came when I was about 23 or 24. And then I started thinking about what writing really meant to me, what made a great work of literature in my mind. And to me, there have to be two things. One is a powerful story. And by that, I don't mean a plot. A plot is very nice. It goes back to the whole tradition of writer as entertainer, people sitting around the fire after a successful hunt, eating their fresh boar or whatever, and listening to the tale of Willibrord the Mighty fighting the giant or something like that, and wondering with bated breath if the giant is going to get Willibrord or Willibrord is going to get the giant. So there is that, and it's important. But what I mean by a story is not the outward plot, but the inner story, which to me really means a story of human soul on trial, the search for a meaning of life, if you will. Let's not settle for less. It's kind of what great literature boils down to in my mind. But the other, no less important aspect is language. I think language is the way we organize our world. And if you as a writer are hoping to create your own artistic world, you have to start with language. You have to reinvent it, recreate it, and come up with a language uniquely your own. And at this point, I have worked on precisely that, crafting my own language for almost 2 decades, but in a different language, in Russian. And so it was quite traumatic and at first devastating to suddenly give it up and start literally from scratch, from zero. But then I thought this really doesn't have to be a drawback, that this does not have to be an impoverishment. This could be an enrichment in a way. I could try to bring my Russian culture and my Russian traditions and the Russian language into what I do in English. And I'll say a couple of words about my recent novel. My most recent novel is called The Line. It was published this year. And it was inspired by a real-life story. Both of my novels are set in Russia, although this one is set in a kind of a dreamscape of Russia in a way. I was actually working on a different book, as things often happen. I was researching what I thought would be my second novel. And in the course of doing research, I came across this astonishing true story, the visit of Igor Stravinsky to Russia in 1962. I'd heard details of it, of course, growing up in Russia, but this was the first time I sort of saw the story in print. Igor Stravinsky left Russia in 1912, before the revolution, and he never went back. He spent his whole life in exile in France and Switzerland and America. And when he was 80 years old, Russia was undergoing the process of liberalization, a thaw. And Khrushchev invited him back for a series of concerts for the first time in 50 years. This was to be his sort of triumphant return home. When people in Leningrad heard that he was coming to give this performance, they lined up to buy tickets to the performance. And they waited in line for the tickets for a whole year. And that's a true story. They really waited for a year to buy tickets to one concert. And the line emerged, evolved into this very elaborate system of lists and kind of its own organization. It became its own microcosm with its own leaders and its own relationships. And I thought, what an amazing, what a fascinating story. It's such a metaphor of a power of art in our lives in many ways. And it touched so many things in me. The Stravinsky's music, which I love because I love that whole period, the early 20th century Russia, where there was such a blossoming across the arts and art and music and dance and literature. And such brightness that just suddenly exploded. But also that very image of the line, it touched something in my youth. I waited in many lines when I was growing up in Russia, but they were not the lines that people hear about when they think Soviet lines. They were not lines for bread and toilet paper. The lines that I waited in were our perestroika lines. And they were the lines precisely like the line for Stravinsky tickets, when suddenly we started getting artists we'd never seen before and musicians we'd never heard before, and people would line up to buy tickets to these concerts. And the atmosphere in these lines were amazing. I mean, it was amazing. It was so palpable, the feeling that you are next to the kindred spirits, people who have the same interests as you do, who are willing to give up hours, if not days of their time to see a performance, to see paintings. You met people in those lines, you talked to people, there was this air of excitement, you made friends. I met my first boyfriend in a line just like that, and it touched something in me on a very deep level. And then I abandoned very shortly the novel that I thought I was researching, because this book would not let me, this image of the line would not stop haunting me. And I wondered about people who would give up not just some hours, but who would literally give up a year of their life. Was it just their love of music? Was there something more? And what did they get in return? What did the line become for them? At what point did it stop being this collection of anonymous strangers and became a community, and with its own friendships and its own relationships and its own antagonisms and its own little world? And so what I wrote is not a historical novel. It is not set in 62, and the composer is not Stravinsky. My composer's name is Igor, and it's kind of almost like a parallel Russia, because what I wanted to tell is really a fable about hope, a fable about our human desires. And I wanted to borrow elements of the dark 30s in Russia, Stalinist repressions, but also these hopeful, exciting 60s, and also more sort of stagnant 70s. And I borrowed these elements from different periods to suit my story. And at the heart of at the book, there lies this mysterious kiosk. There's a very much an element of absurdity in the book. Kafka, or if you know the wonderful Russian Soviet writer Daniel Harms, who is one of my favorites, or Ionesco or Beckett, all these good people. There is that kiosk that never quite opens, and people don't know what it's going to sell, and someone appears every once in a while in the kiosk, and there are rumors flying about, but no one quite knows what is going to happen, and yet they still wait, and then the rumor slowly spreads about this concert, a performance to be given by this returning artist, this returning composer of brilliance. And at the heart of the book is a family of four. There is a mysterious grandmother who is silent, except she suddenly speaks after years of silence to request, for a reason that no one knows at first, a ticket to this performance. And then there are three other family members who wait in shifts at the kiosk, ostensibly on her behalf. Her daughter Anna, a school teacher, her daughter's husband, who is a tuba player in a state band but dreams of hearing great music, and their teenage son, who turned 17 in the course of the book. And these three people who wait in line, they are ostensibly getting the ticket for the grandmother, but in the course of the book, they start wanting the ticket for, or have from the very beginning wanted the ticket for themselves, for reasons of their own, and these reasons sort of develop, and eventually it's these sort of clashing desires that form much of the conflict of the book. I think I'd like to take some questions. What I'll do right before questions is I'll read just a very short segment, just one page, to give you a taste for the book and to show you how I sort of draw on my Russian traditions and pay tribute to the Russian greats. This is a segment from the first part of the book. The narrative alternates between three different voices. There is the mother, Anna, the husband, the wife, the husband, and their son. And then the grandmother's voice just sort of weaves in and out of the narrative. This section is the husband section, Sergei. He's the one who is in a way a failed composer. He had childhood dreams of composing beautiful music. He ends up playing tuba in a dismal state band. He dreams of playing and possibly creating beautiful music. So for him, this concert becomes this possibility, this window into the world of music and art and beauty. And at this point, he's waiting at the kiosk. Nothing happens. The kiosk is not open. There's not even any sign over it. And he gives up and walks away. And this is a segment. And for those of you who've read War and Peace, you recognize the allusion. There's a famous scene of Andrei on the battlefield when he falls down wounded, and he sees the sky above him, and he ignores the battle raging around him, and he notices the sky, and what he sees on the sky is silence. So this is sort of my paraphrase of Tolstoy's scene. Sergei was already at the next intersection when a small beat-up van labored past him. His heart quickening, he turned, followed it with his eyes. The van pulled up to the curb by the kiosk. He swallowed an incoherent, thwarted gasp, and just as the dented door of the van began to jerk open, dashed back, and instantly tripped over his shoelaces and started to fall, but somehow righted himself, and vaulting forward, slipped on the ice and fell again, and this time kept falling, skidding, sliding in a flurry of snow, closing his eyes against the dazzling wet confusion, fully sprawled on his back now, coming at last to a blind, whirling stop. For a moment he did not move. Then, deciding that nothing was broken, he opened his eyes and was just attempting to scramble up when he saw the sky. The sky was pale and empty and vast, and it appeared to float ever higher in transparent layers gradually bleached of all blue tints and shadows, until at some vertiginous, unimaginable height, it seemed to him bled of all color, of all confusion, intense and pure, like the essence of one sustained crystal note. He lay still and looked at it. The van door slammed shut, and two pairs of legs crossed his appended horizon at odd angles. The first pair, ending with black shoes, possibly imported, stepped over him. The second, clumsy in felt boots, circled around, encumbered by a ladder. Sergei looked at the sky. From somewhere above drifted a scraping of wood against metal, a peremptory voice issuing commands, "Move to the left, make sure it's not crooked." And after a minute, the blows of a hammer. Winter muffled each harsh burst in cold, snowy pockets, before the sounds could quite take their jagged, crow-like flight skyward. The sky did not reverberate, for it was immensely distant, and filled to the brim with its own clear, silent, infinite music. When the banging stopped, the two pairs of legs swerved back around him, the door moaned in opening and barked in closing, the motor sneezed and coughed and sped going past. Then all was quiet. A couple of people from the line helped him up. There was now a large sign nailed above the kiosk. It announced in bleached blue letters, "Concert tickets." Too faded to have been freshly painted, a man in a fedora noted with disapproval. They must have taken it from some old kiosk, no longer in operation. Thank you.
People who have questions should come to the microphones that are in these two aisles. And I would like to start the question. Olga, did you learn English in school in Moscow? And if you did, how fluent was your English when you came to Atlanta?
Well, I actually started learning French. In my family, my father spoke French and my mother spoke English. And we early on, sort of at a family council, decided that French would be my language. But luckily for me, I think my father was a very impatient teacher. And after a few sessions, we decided that no, I'll do English instead. And my mother was a lot more patient with me. So there was a little bit at home. And then I started going to school, and we did have some English. But eventually I ended up at a wonderful sort of special school with a concentration in English. And we had very intensive English. So my English was fairly good, I would say, by the time I came. Definitely not fluent, and I definitely struggled at first. And I mean, I could understand everything, but it was far from being what I wanted it to be. And now when I reread my old college papers, I'm amazed at the amount of basic grammar mistakes that I made. It was, of course. So.
You said you went to start to write English. Now we're seeing many authors that are being translated from foreign languages into English. Have you ever thought, instead of changing English to start, is just translate some of your older books or continue to write in Russian?
I thought about it, and that was the first thing I did. I tried many different things. It was a very painful process. one of the things I did to switch to English is I had this idea inspired by Nabokov, learning the dictionary from A to Z, which is not a thing to do and not recommended. He did it, and I actually made it through the C's. And I always think if at any point anyone does a sort of a scholarly study of my vocabulary, they will find an unusual concentration of obscure words, starting with A's and B's and maybe a little bit of C's, and then it tapers off. So there was that, and then what I did was, yes, I did take some of my early writings, which were Russian, some short stories, and I translated them in English, and I even had a few of them published. But it just did not sound like English. In fact, what I'm attempting to do in my English is sort of fuse it with the Russian intonation and the paraphrases of certain Russian thought processes almost and metaphors that are dear to me. But the way to do it just sort of directly from Russian to English, it does not work. I have to think in English in order for me to write in English, which is what I do, and then I just try to bring in my Russian half.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is that your mother language is not English, so how could you overcome the difficulty of a foreign language to write in? Because I have the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Iran, and my mother language is Farsi, so I'm here. I really want to do something in English, but it's very difficult. I mean, how could you overcome the difficulties?
Well, I've just touched on that a little bit. I think, living in the country, thinking in the language helps a lot. And I think that was really the first step that, eventually sometimes I'm asked the question that I always find very interesting, what language do you dream in? And there comes a point where you stop dreaming in your native language and start dreaming in your new language. And I think at that point it sort of becomes really part of who you are. And it's really just immersion. I mean, and reading a lot in the language, and of course experimenting. I did a lot of writing that was quite clunky before I think I reached the point where I'm comfortable with my English. So.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Justin Williams, and I'm writing a horror novel. I just wanted to know, how is it that I can go by getting my book published without knowing anyone in the business?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that's what I did. I know there is this belief, or quite often I hear that it's impossible to get published unless you have an in the industry. You have to know someone. Your, best friend has to be married to an agent or whatever. That was not the case with me. I never took a single writing class ever. I haven't known a single writer, actually. So what I did is I got a little thin book that said how to break into writing, and I always think this is the best $10 I've ever spent. I think it's still available. It's just a little, how to publish your writing, and it tells you to double space your manuscript and send it out, and which is what I did. It was great advice. And then after that, I got a few credits publishing short stories. I'm a very organized person. I'm not a short story writer by inclination. I'm a novel. I always wanted to be a novelist. I don't think I can ever fit what I want to say into a short format, which I'm sure is a drawback. But but I told myself somehow 10 was the number for me, that I will publish 10 short stories just to publish them, just to get my foot on the door. And then once I've published 10 stories, then I'll turn to writing a novel. And I knew what my first novel would be. You have to have something that you care about, and then you just send it out and hope for the best. And I don't know. It's worked for a lot of people, a lot more than you would think.
Thank you. I love your work also.
Thank you so much.
You say you're a very organized person, so my question to
I
you...
lie, but...
Yeah. Well, my question for you on that is that, your process for writing, coming up with the ideas, do you storyboard it? Do you write an outline? Do you write in the middle of the night or early morning? Do you have to be out of your house in a different location?
On the ideas, I do keep a kind of a writer's diary, which is not a diary of my life, but I've always kept it. And I don't write down things that happen to me. I write down ideas. I frequently go back and look through different jots of ideas. And in fact, my idea for my first novel, I went through all. When I decided I was ready to start writing my first novel, I went back through, by then maybe 20 volumes of these little notebooks, and pulled all the ideas that seemed novel-worthy, and then just focused on what drew me in the best. And then, yes, I do write an outline, at least for the first two books, I absolutely did. It's almost a chapter-by-chapter outline. You know, some writers say they kind of just start writing with an image or a character, and then it takes them wherever it takes them, and the characters surprise them by doing something. I think if my character ever surprised me by doing something I didn't mean him to do, I would be kind of upset. So for me, it's organized, but there is enough space and enough air for it to breathe. So it's not so set. It's not scene by scene. It's kind of more of direction of things, and then. Sometimes it does take you in sort of unexpected directions. And in the first book, for instance, there are a couple of chapters that sort of popped up that were not in the outline, but just in a way almost wrote themselves. And sometimes people say they think these are the best chapters. And they do feel different from the rest of the writing. So for my second book, because of that, I left a little more time and left a little more space in the outline, was a little more spontaneous, let sort of a little more air. So it's still, maybe for the third book, I'm trying a different approach. So it's an evolving. It evolves. So.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize there was a mic here.
You said, Jay, you write in English and then you work in your Russian paraphrasing and things like that. Do you ever find yourself either consciously or unconsciously, as you go back and look at your work later, trying to correct misperceptions or that kind of thing about a different culture, a culture that for a long time was in conflict with the United States, that kind of thing, just kind of making it humanizing that part of the world?
Well, I think a role of any writer is to take something that they know and bring it closer to other people. And you have to sympathize with your character, and hopefully the reader will sympathize with the character. So, of course, I don't do it consciously. I don't consciously set out to correct misperceptions or certainly not, I don't have any messages in my work. I think that's more the domain of the nonfiction writers. You inhabit your own artistic, creative world, and you let your sort of fictional characters, do the talking for you. Really, there's no message. But certainly, I think that's a beautiful thing about reading fiction is that the writer has a power to bring you into his or her own world, something that he or she knows, and that you will then, know better as well. So, hopefully. Okay.
Thank you so much, Olga. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.